Hello. It's been a minute and I wanted to share, there's been so much that's been happening. And in particular, I wanted to share how the shifts, the patterns that I've been reducing, removing, healing, how they've affected relationships, especially with my husband, who I've been with together. We've been together for 34 years. We've been married for 28 and massive shifts. I'm more deeply in love with my husband than I've ever been in our relationship, even though we couldn't be further apart when it comes to our beliefs and values. And I also wanted to share with my son, who's still at home, leaving in a couple of weeks, pretty major shifts that happened there that actually had implications across the ancestry. So pretty fundamental, foundational shifts that I've experienced that I wanted to share with you and where it came from. But before I get started, I wanted to share a foundational concept or principle of attachment theory. So it's basically understanding your emotional behavioral patterns and relationships, and it was first developed by a British psychologist, John Bowlby, in the 50s. And then it was later expanded by Mary Ainsworth. And it's basically all about how early relationship caregivers shape our ability to form emotional bonds as adults. And the premise is that every child wants comfort and safety to regulate stress, to explore the world, and to build confidence. And then the way the caregiver responds becomes the psychological model for future relationships for the child. And there's four attachment types. There's secure attachment. And this is where the caregiver is emotionally attuned and responsive to the child. And this is 50 to 60% of adults have this. And it results in adult that's able to trust others, that's able to get close without losing themselves, can handle conflict well, and communicates needs. And then there's insecure attachment. And there are three types of insecure attachment. There's anxious attachment. And this is where the caregiver was emotionally distant or rejecting. And this resulted in a child they're inconsistent. So sometimes they're warm and sometimes they're distant, resulting in an adult that craves, closeness, but fears abandonment. It needs constant reassurance. So that's anxious attachment. And then the second one is avoidant attachment, where the caregiver was emotionally distant or rejecting. And this leads to an adult that's independent to a fault. They shut down in conflict, they avoid intimacy, and they're emotionally distant. And then the third kind is disorganized attachment. And this is where there was trauma or abuse by the caregiver that results in the child having both fear and comfort from the caregiver. And it results in an adult that has chaotic relationships, push-pull dynamics. They like anxious and avoidant, high anxiety, high avoidance, and then they're unaware of their patterns. And the great thing about all of this is that once you start becoming aware of these patterns, you can actually start to shift them. So you can become more secure in your attachment and in your relationships with others. I'm going to share a couple of examples of how I've discovered how this applies in my life and what I've started to see as a shift. So I'm going to start with, I was working with my partner who's also a coach, and he was giving me some feedback about my videos, and he could immediately, because he's very attuned to energy, he was able to tune in to when he asked me what I was feeling, and he could sense that there was fear, there was something there. And I tuned into it, and I was like, I take all feedback as like criticism, like I'm a failure or rejection. That's what I started noticing. And he was like, it's okay. What is it that you're feeling? And I started tuning into it. And I started like feeling that sadness or that fear. And then as I tuned into my body, I could feel a lump in my throat, a tightness in my chest, like a knot in my gut. When I tuned into it, I started to feel that like overwhelming sadness. I was able to go deeper into it. And with reassurance from my partner, what I was able to then what started coming to me was I started feeling that sadness and I started feeling like the tears up. And I got this image of this black volcanic rock. And it was like, and he asked me like, what is the fear? And what was coming to me was like, it's like a fear that like when people get to know me, like I'm rotten to the core and they're going to get to know me and then they're going to reject me or they're going to abandon me. And this is like anxious attachment, one of the insecure attachments where you crave closeness, but you fear abandonment and you need constant reassurance. And so that's, I think, certainly it seems to be a pattern that I've experienced quite a bit. And so when I started to feel that fear, being rejected, and then as he was holding this space, I started getting this image as I went deeper, of a little baby. And this was me. I felt like it was me with my arms outstretched, like wanting to be held. And and like just holding that image, that space, and just allowing it, tuning into what I was feeling in my body and what it was like emotionally and the sensation in my body. And then what I started seeing was like, I started feeling tears because I could feel the baby, like, and the fear and the desperation and like the desire for being to be held and to be loved. And then I saw my current self pick up the baby and start to fold her. And I'm getting like shivers even like thinking about it now. And I started to feel like just like a sense of belonging in my body and on the earth, like a closeness, like wanting to protect this part of me and hold her. And then I suddenly got this image as soon as I was tuning into that and feeling that sense of belonging. I like almost like I kicked that rotten core, that volcanic rock out of the scene. And then I was just cradling this like part of me. And there were tears, there were all these tears that I was feeling and I was experiencing. And the way I was describing it then was like I was like almost like the womb to this baby, like protective arms around, like swaddle and hold. And I could feel all my cells were coming and this really deep sense of belonging to myself. Is what I felt was really beautiful and stunning. And then he asked me if I would be willing to say, I love you to this part of me. And I couldn't say it. And I thought it and I felt it, but there was something that I was resisting. It was like almost a fear of if I said it out loud, it might not feel authentic or genuine, and then it would destroy this feeling that I had. And then he said, it's okay, whatever you feel comfortable with. And I started feeling myself shifting, almost like moving away from this image, this cave that I tapped into. And it was almost this feeling of I had touched something really sacred deep within, but it's not a place that I can stay. Like I had released some of the fear through my tears and through this experience, but now it's sacred. So we're going to let it be within that cave, that deep space within. And we're going to come back out. And I just felt this sense of like safety and like peace that I was then carrying. And I realized like that came from insecure attachment. And I was like, as I was healing, seeing the pattern of not being able to take feedback and then follow the thread into my vulnerability and then be able to hold space and heal myself and release some of that, be able to start feeling more secure attachment. So it's starting to shift my relationships. And one in particular that's been shifting so dramatically is with my husband. So he's actually an agnostic clinical evidence-based physician. He couldn't be further apart from me in terms of a lot of our values and beliefs now. And we both started out in the same place. We've known each other for 34 years. We were in school together and we were both very left brain dominant, like analytical. I went into engineering. He did engineering too, and then went on to medicine. And I went on to business school. And it was like, what can we objectively measure? It's like success is like what we accomplish. Is a world of scarcity. Everyone's competing to try to succeed or win. We're both very aligned in that. And as I've been going through this journey, I've shifted into tapping into the right brain, into the body, the somatic, this language of the subconscious emotion and sensation, and seeing these patterns and then healing and releasing. And we jokingly say we don't even agree on death. We're so far apart. He believes in one life, rot in the ground, and I believe in multiple lives, epic journey of learning. So couldn't be further apart. And one of the questions he's asked is like, how are we going to come back together? Like, we are so far apart. Like, what's going to happen to us? And the thing that I told him was like, I hear you, man, and I worry about it sometimes, but I feel like it's a shift that I'm moving through and that I'm not sure how, but I feel like we're going to find a way to come back together. And I'm going to share with you like how that's actually happening. It was like a morning that I got up and my husband was like sharing with me and the kids that he was taking the car in a couple of days and would be visiting a friend and then going to a conference for a couple of days. And I felt my anger rising, like instinctively, like suddenly instantaneously start rising. And I was like, man, I took the car. I was going to take it for one day up in the city And you gave me so much shit about taking one of the cars, and then the rest of you would have to manage with one less car. And I minimize my trip. And like every trip I minimize, I don't visit any friends. And I try to keep it super short. And here you are, like taking all kinds of liberty. We end up getting this heated argument, like many of one of these old patterns, got into this heated argument where it's, you're always criticizing me and making comments, and then you take all this liberty and do whatever you want. And like, he's like, why don't you just do whatever you want? And it was like, we ended up in this heated place, and he's fine. Maybe I shouldn't say anything at all. And I was like, that's great. Then we'll go get even more distant. And so we came to this place of silence, which is a place we often come, where we both get really angry and one of us walks away, or we both just become silent. And then when we cool off, we like forget about it and act like nothing happened, and then comes back at some point. And this time we got to this place. We were in the kitchen and we both became quiet. And then all of a sudden, and this has never happened for me before, in the middle of this argument, all of a sudden, I like saw the pattern. And what I realized was, so I saw the pattern and I felt, and then I tuned into my body. And I felt it within my body. I felt a tightness in my gut and a lump in my throat, and I like softened into it. And I immediately started to cry. And then I shared with him, I say, this is the pattern. Notice, like, I put you in a position of authority, like a parent, because I'm seeking that validation, that secure attachment that I didn't feel like I had from my caregivers, my parents. So I put you in this position of authority, and then I try to get your validation or approval. So I interpret what you say, and I like make assumptions that aren't always right. And then I try to do everything people pleasing and like work really hard to try to line up to get that approval or validation that I'm seeking. And when I don't get it, I want to rebel. And I said, so when I got this feedback from you about not having the cars and so on, I like made an assumption. You don't want me to do that. You don't want to be with this. So then I tried to people please, cut all my trips down and do all these things. And then when I see you do it, it was all this anger because I had imprisoned myself making an assumption about and wanting to please you. And then when I see you take liberty, that's when it was creating all of this anger and rage. And I was like, I'd moved to this like softened place where I was sharing it with him. And then he started to share, he started to open and shared how he always wondered what made me rebel. And I was sharing how I feel like I'm a guest in his house. And he said, what do you mean? So at first I was like, this is your fault. This is when I was in the anger and the heat. And then when I saw the pattern, I'm like, no, this has nothing to do with, this is me. This is my pattern. And then as I was like, I'd come back to center. And then I said, it's actually also the way I receive the feedbacks of like, I'm trying to change a pattern of behavior and try to become more independent or become more focused on the things that I want rather than trying to just do the things that I think you want. But if I get all this constant feedback, it makes it hard for me to step out of the pattern. And I said, I feel like a guest in your home. And he was like, what do you mean? And I said, I don't watch TV shows I don't think you'll watch, or shows I just watch on my own in the bedroom or on my phone. And there are a lot of shows that you just put on and you feel comfortable putting on that I don't like or I don't want, but I don't say anything. Or even pillows and blankets. Like you made comments, we have too many of them. So it's like this craving. I want to buy a pillow. It's not even much money, but I've like limited myself. And then I have these cravings or these desires unfulfilled desires that I limit myself on because I'm seeking that approval or validation. And then I said, I don't even share all my beliefs with the kids, and now they have your views. And at that point, I started to cry and say, I could be invisible and you wouldn't even know. Like, it wouldn't even miss me. And I came to this place of like tears and sobbing, and he was just super present and tuned into the space. And then when I came back to center after shedding tears, he said, he softened too. And he said, I realize now, because he had wanted help with the finances or like planning trips, and because he would give me feedback, I just said, he's the expert, and I seem to keep getting it wrong. Instead of taking that feedback as an input, I took it as criticism and rejection and failure and not getting the approval or validation I wanted. So then I just stopped doing those things. And it ended up making him feel alone and scared because he had to make these financial decisions on his own, and he had to plan all these things on his own, and he didn't feel like I was there with him. And I was feeling alone because I didn't feel accepted or approved or loved. And so it was just this surprising realization that we were both almost silently suffering, even though we were both feeling alone. And then as we were just holding that space, and I said, but you think about it, we're both products of our conditioning too. When I look at my mom and when I look at my mother-in-law, like their whole worlds revolved around their husbands. That's what they were conditioned to do in Indian culture. Like the women were like defer. And when you say, just do whatever you want, like maybe because of your conditioning, men are, especially in like my art, my background, it's like they really favored like having boys and treated them like they got more liberty and more freedom and more autonomy, and were conditioned to be more dominant and women were more submissive. And so maybe we both fallen into these patterns of behavior by default because of the conditioning. And so it's hard for me to just do what I want if I don't think you're aligned with it or in agreement with it, because my conditioning is it's harder for me to do that. And maybe similarly for you, maybe you don't even really know what it feels like because you aren't conditioned to defer as frequently or as often. And it was interesting because we ended up coming to this place where I took him off the pedestal and I raised my own self-worth. So we were like peers for the first time. And I realized like in that moment, what was so fascinating was like, so one of the things that he said as I've been shifting, I shared with him that as I tune into my vulnerability, see these patterns and I tune into my vulnerability and my fears and find and become vulnerable and feel the pain and release it through tears or through like support with someone, I can now feel and I have a sense of belonging and I'm more self-compassion, more love of self, parts of me that I couldn't accept before I now falling in love with. And that's what allowed me to connect with his parts that were vulnerable, to actually feel and be able to resonate with his tenderness and fall more deeply in love with him. And even though our beliefs are so far apart, different values, different beliefs, when I started tuning into these things, my vulnerabilities, my fears, my hopes, my dreams, the things that make me human, I was able to connect in my humanity to his. Things that make us human are what really deeply connect us, or at least made me feel so connected to him. So as I clear these blocks, I can just feel myself and then other. And he'd been saying like, yeah, but I know you're saying you feel it, but I'm not feeling it. I feel like we still have very different views. And so in this moment, I felt my heart open. And I like went like something I've never done in the middle of an argument. I went close to him and I just put my arms around him. And I said, can you feel? He was like, he just looked at me like even captured, but he was like the warmest smile. And he said, I can. And I think I have never felt more close to my husband than I did in that. And what I realized was that it was, and I think this is not just happening for us, but it's happening across the board, is like that connection to each other by tapping into our vulnerabilities and our fears, our hopes and our dreams. As we see things shifting across the collective, it's like more divide and division across like socioeconomic and religion and race and gender and so on. It's like people becoming more divided, more echo chambers from like technology and AI. And so people feeling more and more disconnected from each other, reaching points of so much distress that they're tuning inwards because there's nowhere else to go. And tapping into those vulnerabilities and fears, that's what's like finding our humanity. And I believe that's what's going to ultimately connect us to each other and heal. And so my husband and I, like, he was like, I felt all this energy and like love. And he said, do you want to watch, a few seconds later, he said, do you want to watch the second series of Dexter with me? Like he's a big fan of that show. I was like, sure. And it was like he was asking me on a date or something. And we started watching it. And I don't know, for the last 10 years, I didn't think of it as an actual problem. We sat on separate plates of the couch and we'd watch shows or whatever, and kind of roommates maybe. And after a little while, he like came over and like just curled up next to me. And I just like my heart started racing, got all excited. And I was thinking like it was like felt like a teenager, like when we were early on in our relationship, when we started dating, like that excitement that comes from someone that you really like. And then a little bit later, he just put his hand on mine, and I just felt chills. Like my whole body started tingling, and I looked at him, and I was like, "What are you feeling right now?" He was like, "I don't know." And I was like realizing like part of my craving and my desire for like constant reassurance and extrinsic validation came from the fact that because of all these blocks and this trauma and this insecure attachment, I just couldn't feel much within myself and then, of course, with other. So I needed more and more of that drug, that validation to feel anything. More extreme, like thrill seeking and like getting so I could feel something. I had to go to more extremes. And as I clear and heal, I don't need as much. It can be a touch of the hand or just like a shift in energy and just like a few words, just much. So it's transformational in these relationships. It just absolutely stunning. So now I see a path forward for us and miraculously. And so we're going from being like codependent, unhealthy, like reliance on each other and me deferring to him and needing his approval, for example, to independence where I detached from him to gain my own, almost like a child that's growing up. It's gain my own independence. And so I would like disconnect from him and rebel from him to the point where now I'm like interdependence, where I can like feel him and take his input, but be my own person and decide what it is that I really need or want and be able to express that. Like secure attachment, to be able to trust others, to communicate my needs, to be able to handle conflict, and to be close without losing myself. Like secure attachment is really what I'm starting to learn. Just been. And the second thing I'm going to share with you that was so powerful was a few days later, I was driving to pick up my younger son who's about to go to college in a few weeks. And on the way there, I was like thinking about major shifts I'm experiencing in this long-term relationship. I thought I wasn't sure where it was going to end up. And I was reflecting back on like the relationship to attachment theory, like what I must have been seeking from my parents that I didn't feel like I got. And so I was like thinking about that, like why I keep seeking this external validation and putting people in positions of authority like a parent to try to get what I didn't feel like I got as a child. That's secure attachment. And then I tuned into my dad first, and I suddenly could feel the love that he felt for me as a child, like what he must have felt. I don't know, something about like suddenly was stepped into his shoes, and I just felt this love for this kid, this baby, like all this love. And then I same thing with my mom. And I just started to sob because I was like, I couldn't feel it then for whatever reason, like maybe because of trauma or because of the way I was wired or who knows. But when I'm 52, I'm like feeling that the love was in fact always there. I just couldn't feel it. And so then when my son got in the car, I went to pick him up and I was like telling him about what I discovered. And he like put his hand out and he's, Mom, I hope you know that I love you. And I like couldn't even say it back. I just started to choke on the words and I started to cry because it was so moving. And then as soon as we got home, he like got out of the car and he came around, he just embraced me in a really long hug. And he's, Mom, I love you. I said, I love you so much. And like for all the times that like you might not have felt it, I want you to know that I always loved you, will always love you. And he was like, he said, I have felt it. I feel it. And I know I know it. And we just stayed there. And what occurred to me after that was like, it was like I was saying the words, like not only healed, it healed a relationship with my parents. Like the thing I would have wanted them to say to me, or I would have said to myself to heal that wound, that I was able to say like with my son. And it was almost like this experience was healing it, like across like the lineage, across like ancestral lines. It was so beautiful. So it's just stunning and it's phenomenal. And I wish to be able to bring what I'm learning and what we're moving through to others that would love to just, that might be struggling in their relationships or just want to take it to the level of depth that's possible. And I don't even think I think I've barely scratched the surface of what's possible. So just wanted to share that with you, invite you to share your experiences back. Thank you so